In the summer of 1921, a young Swiss schoolteacher named Heinrich Zimmer sat in a café in Munich, turning over a set of tarot cards that a friend had given him as a joke. Zimmer was not interested in fortune-telling. He was a scholar of Indian philosophy, a man who spent his days reading ancient Sanskrit texts and tracing the patterns of Hindu mythology. But as he laid the cards out on the marble table, one after another in numerical sequence from 0 to 21, something caught his attention that would occupy his mind for the rest of his life. He was not looking at 22 separate images. He was looking at a story. The realization came not gradually, but all at once, the way a hidden pattern in a mosaic suddenly becomes visible when you step back far enough. The cards were not a random collection of symbolic figures. They were arranged in a sequence that told a coherent narrative, a narrative he recognized. He had read this story before, not in one book, but in hundreds, not in one language, but in dozens, not in one culture, but across every civilization he had ever studied. The fool stepping off the cliff was the hero at the beginning of every epic. The magician was the first teacher. The high priestess was the guardian of the threshold. The sequence continued with a logic that was not arbitrary but organic, each card depicting a stage that naturally followed from the previous one and led inevitably to the next. Zimmer abandoned his coffee and spent the next several hours in the café, filling his notebook with correspondences. The fool's journey, as he would later call it, mapped onto the hero's journey in Hindu mythology. It mapped onto the stages of Buddhist enlightenment. It mapped onto the trials of Odysseus, the wanderings of Gilgamesh, the labors of Hercules. It mapped onto the structure of Dante's Divine Comedy, the progression of Shakespeare's late romances, the narrative arc of virtually every significant work of literature he had ever encountered. 22 cards, and they contained within their sequence the skeleton key to every story humanity had ever told about what it meant to grow from innocence into wisdom. Zimmer wrote immediately to Carl Jung, with whom he had been corresponding about the relationship between Eastern and Western symbolic systems. Jung's response was swift and enthusiastic. He had been developing a similar intuition independently. The tarot's major arcana, Jung wrote back, appeared to represent what he was beginning to call the process of individuation, the psychological journey from unconscious wholeness through fragmentation, suffering, and conscious integration, back to wholeness at a higher level of awareness. The fool's journey was not merely a mythological pattern. It was the pattern of human psychological development itself, encoded in 22 images that could be read as a map of every human life. The investigation that followed would span decades and draw contributions from psychologists, mythologists, anthropologists, literary scholars, and philosophers. What they collectively uncovered was not simply a parallel between the tarot and various mythological traditions. They uncovered evidence that the sequence of the major arcana corresponded to actual observable stages of human psychological development, stages that every person passed through in the course of becoming fully themselves, stages that could be identified in the lived experience of real individuals and not merely in the abstract patterns of mythology. The journey began, as all journeys must, with the Fool, card 0, unnumbered or sometimes numbered with the 0 that precedes all counting. The Fool stands at the edge of a cliff, one foot already in the air, eyes turned upward toward the sky rather than downward toward the abyss. A small dog, sometimes interpreted as instinct or loyalty, nips at his heels. He carries a small bundle on a stick containing everything he owns, which is almost nothing. His expression is not fearful but ecstatic. He does not know what lies ahead, and this unknowing is experienced not as dread but as freedom. Jung recognized in the Fool the state of original unconscious wholeness that characterizes early childhood. The infant does not yet know the difference between self and world, between inner and outer, between possible and impossible. Everything is potential. Nothing has been decided. The child is whole precisely because it has not yet been divided by the process of socialization, education, and identity formation. The Fool's ecstasy is the ecstasy of pure potential, the state before any particular path has been chosen and all paths remain open. But the Fool's wholeness is unconscious. It is wholeness by default, not by achievement. The child is whole because it has not yet been challenged, not because it has met and integrated all challenges. This is the crucial distinction that the entire Fool's journey depends upon. The goal of the journey is not to return to the Fool's original innocence, but to arrive at a new kind of wholeness, one that has been earned through experience, tested through suffering, and achieved through conscious integration of all the aspects of human nature that the journey reveals. The first figure the Fool encounters is the Magician, card number 1. The magician stands behind a table on which 4 objects are arranged: a cup, a sword, a wand, and a pentacle, representing the 4 elements and the 4 fundamental dimensions of human experience: feeling, thinking, willing, and sensing. One hand points upward toward heaven, the other downward toward earth. Above his head floats the lemniscate, the figure-8 symbol of infinity. Jung and his colleagues identified the magician as the archetype of conscious awareness itself, the moment when the developing psyche first recognizes that it has will, intention, and the capacity to act upon the world. In developmental terms, this corresponds to the emergence of ego consciousness in early childhood, the moment when the child first recognizes itself as a separate being with agency and purpose. The magician's 4 tools represent the basic capacities that consciousness brings: the ability to feel, to think, to create, and to perceive the material world. A case from Jung's practice illustrated this stage vividly. A man in his 40s came to Jung describing a persistent sense that he had never truly begun his life. Despite having a career, a family, and all the outward trappings of adulthood, he felt that he was still waiting for something to start. In his dreams, he repeatedly found himself standing before a table laden with tools he did not know how to use. Jung recognized immediately that this man had not fully consolidated the magician stage, the stage at which a person claims their own will and capacity to act. His life had been lived in response to others' expectations rather than from his own conscious intention. The therapeutic work involved helping him, for the first time, to pick up the tools on the table and begin to use them. The second card, the High Priestess, represented the next necessary stage, the encounter with the unconscious. If the magician represented the emergence of conscious will, the High Priestess represented the recognition that consciousness was only half the picture. Behind the veil she guarded lay everything that the conscious mind could not directly perceive: intuition, dreams, the wisdom of the body, the accumulated knowledge of the species. The developing psyche, having discovered its conscious powers, had to learn that these powers were limited, that there existed vast territories of inner experience that could not be accessed through will or reason alone. Jung observed that many people became stuck at the boundary between the magician and the High Priestess. They developed strong conscious minds, powerful wills, and effective rational capacities, but they lost touch with the unconscious dimension of their experience. These individuals often arrived in his consulting room complaining of emptiness, creative blocks, or a sense that their lives, though successful by external measures, lacked depth and meaning. The High Priestess stage required not the development of new abilities, but the cultivation of receptivity, the willingness to listen to what the unconscious was saying rather than always directing and controlling. The Empress, card 3, brought the journey into the realm of creative fertility and embodied experience. Where the High Priestess represented knowledge that was hidden and internal, the Empress represented the principle of bringing forth, of creativity made manifest. She was the archetype of nature itself, of abundance, sensuality, and the creative power of the feminine principle. The developing psyche, having discovered both conscious will and unconscious depth, now had to learn to create, to bring something new into being, to participate in the generative process of life itself. The Emperor, card 4, introduced the complementary principle of structure, authority, and order. Where the Empress created through natural abundance and organic growth, the Emperor created through design, discipline, and the imposition of form upon chaos. The developing psyche needed both capacities, the ability to let things grow naturally and the ability to shape them deliberately. Jung noted that many psychological problems arose from an imbalance between these two principles, either too much Emperor, producing rigidity, control, and sterility, or too much Empress, producing chaos, boundary dissolution, and lack of direction. Card 5, the Hierophant, represented the encounter with tradition, teaching, and transmitted wisdom. The developing psyche, having discovered its own capacities for consciousness, intuition, creation, and structure, now had to confront the fact that it was not the first to make this journey. Others had gone before. Their wisdom had been organized into systems of teaching, systems of belief, institutions of learning, and religion. The Hierophant represented the necessary stage of learning from tradition, of apprenticing oneself to accumulated wisdom, of standing on the shoulders of those who had come before. But the Hierophant also represented a danger, the danger of remaining an apprentice forever, of substituting received wisdom for personal experience, of never progressing beyond the stage of obedient student to the stage of autonomous seeker. Jung saw this danger manifested in individuals who clung to religious or philosophical systems with rigid certainty, using doctrine as a substitute for the more difficult and uncertain work of personal psychological development. The Hierophant's teaching was necessary, but it was meant to be a stage in the journey, not its destination. Card 6, the Lovers, introduced what Jung considered one of the most critical and most frequently misunderstood stages of the journey. The popular interpretation of this card emphasized romantic love, but Jung and his colleagues understood it as representing something more fundamental, the principle of choice and the encounter with the other. The developing psyche, having been shaped by parental figures, the Empress and Emperor, and by tradition, the Hierophant, now faced its first truly independent decision. It had to choose, and in choosing, it had to define itself. The Lover's card also represented the first conscious encounter with the contrasexual aspect of the psyche, what Jung called the anima in men and the animus in women. The developing personality, having formed a conscious identity, was now confronted with the realization that this identity was partial, that it excluded an entire dimension of human experience associated with the opposite gender. The Lover's stage required the beginning of dialogue with this excluded dimension, a dialogue that would continue throughout the remainder of the journey. The Chariot, card 7, depicted a figure riding a vehicle drawn by two sphinxes or horses, one light and one dark. This card represented the stage at which the developing psyche, having made its choices and begun to integrate opposing forces within itself, now directed its consolidated will toward a goal in the external world. The Chariot was the stage of youthful ambition, of setting out to conquer the world, of channeling all one's energies toward achievement and mastery. It was the archetype of the young adult who has discovered their powers and is eager to test them against reality. Jung noted that many people in Western culture considered the Chariot stage the pinnacle of human development. The successful, driven, goal-oriented individual who knew what they wanted and pursued it relentlessly was the cultural ideal. But the tarot suggested that this stage, far from being the end of the journey, was barely a third of the way through. The remaining 15 cards depicted stages of development that went far beyond what conventional society typically recognized or valued, stages that required not the conquest of the external world, but the far more difficult conquest of oneself. Card 8, Strength, depicted a woman gently closing or opening the mouth of a lion. Unlike the Chariot, which showed mastery through force and control, Strength showed mastery through gentleness, patience, and compassion. The developing psyche, having tested its powers against the external world, now had to learn a different kind of power, the power to master its own instincts and passions not through suppression, but through understanding and love. This was a stage that many people arrived at through crisis. The driven, ambitious individual who had conquered the external world suddenly found themselves confronted with inner forces they could not dominate through willpower alone. Anger, desire, fear, jealousy, these primal energies could not be controlled through the Chariot's methods of sheer determination. They required a fundamentally different approach, one based on relationship rather than domination, on integration rather than suppression. The woman in the Strength card did not kill the lion. She befriended it. She transformed it from an adversary into an ally. Card 9, the Hermit, depicted a solitary figure standing on a mountaintop holding a lantern in one hand and a staff in the other. This was the stage of withdrawal, of turning inward, of seeking truth through solitude and introspection rather than through engagement with the external world. The Hermit represented the necessary midlife passage in which the individual, having achieved what the world had to offer, recognized that something essential was still missing and turned inward to find it. Jung observed that this stage often coincided with what was commonly called the midlife crisis, though he preferred to think of it as the midlife opportunity. The individual who had lived entirely through external achievement and social identity was suddenly confronted with the question of who they were when all external definitions were stripped away. The Hermit's lantern represented the light of introspection, the willingness to examine one's own nature honestly and without illusion. The mountaintop represented the isolation that this work required, the necessary withdrawal from the noise and demands of social life. A patient of Jung's who exemplified this stage was a successful lawyer in his 50s who suddenly lost all interest in his career. His colleagues were baffled. He had been at the height of his powers, winning cases, earning accolades, building a reputation. Yet overnight, or so it seemed, he stopped caring about any of it. He began spending long hours alone, walking in the mountains, reading philosophy, sitting in silence. His wife feared he was depressed. His partners feared he was having a breakdown. Jung recognized something different. The man was entering the Hermit stage. His external journey had reached its natural conclusion, and his internal journey was beginning. The work of therapy was not to return him to his previous life, but to support his passage into a new and deeper phase of development. Card 10, the Wheel of Fortune, introduced a radical shift in perspective. After the intense inward focus of the Hermit, the Wheel of Fortune confronted the individual with the reality of forces larger than themselves. The wheel turned, and circumstances changed, regardless of individual will or intention. Success gave way to failure. Health gave way to illness. Youth gave way to age. The developing psyche, having discovered both its outer and inner powers, now had to confront the limits of those powers. It had to learn to work with the forces of fate and chance rather than imagining it could control them. Card 11, Justice, represented the encounter with the principle of consequence and accountability. Every choice made throughout the journey had produced effects. Every action had consequences. The stage of justice required the individual to face these consequences honestly, to take responsibility for the effects of their choices, and to develop the capacity for clear, unbiased discernment. This was not the justice of external law, but the justice of psychological truth, the ability to see oneself and one's actions clearly, without the distortions of ego or self-deception. Card 12, the Hanged Man, was one of the most paradoxical and most psychologically significant cards in the entire sequence. It depicted a figure suspended upside down, hanging by one foot from a wooden beam or tree, with an expression not of suffering but of peaceful illumination. The Hanged Man represented the stage at which all conventional approaches to life had to be abandoned. The world had to be seen from a fundamentally different perspective. Everything the individual had learned about success, power, achievement, and control had to be temporarily suspended, turned upside down, so that a new kind of understanding could emerge. Jung understood the Hanged Man as the archetype of voluntary sacrifice, the willingness to surrender one's established identity and way of seeing in order to gain access to a deeper truth. This was not passive suffering, but active surrender, the deliberate choice to let go of everything one had been in order to discover what one might become. Many of the most significant breakthroughs in Jung's therapeutic work occurred at this stage, when patients finally stopped trying to fix themselves according to their existing self-image and allowed themselves to be transformed into something they could not yet imagine. One case that powerfully illustrated the hangman stage involved a woman who had been a political activist for most of her adult life. She had defined herself entirely through her causes, her beliefs, her commitment to changing the world. In her 50s, she experienced a crisis that she could not understand. She still believed in her causes, but they no longer sustained her. The passion that had driven her for decades had evaporated, leaving emptiness in its place. She described feeling suspended between her old identity and something unknown, unable to go back and unable to move forward. Jung recognized the hangman pattern immediately. The woman's activist identity, which had served her well for decades, had reached the limit of what it could teach her. She was being asked to let go of this identity not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. The Hanged Man stage demanded not the abandonment of her values, but the discovery of a deeper source from which those values could be renewed. The suspension she experienced, the feeling of being caught between worlds, was not a pathology to be cured, but a necessary passage that had to be endured. Card 13 was death. Not literal death, but the death of what had been, the irreversible transformation that followed the hangman's sacrifice. The developing psyche, having surrendered its old identity, now had to let that identity die completely. This was the stage of genuine transformation, the point of no return where the old self was released and space was created for something new to emerge. Jung observed that this stage was often experienced as a period of intense grief even when what was dying was a source of suffering. The familiar, even when painful, was preferred to the unknown. The death card in the tarot almost always depicted not only destruction but also signs of new growth, flowers blooming from the ground, a sun rising on the horizon, a river flowing toward the sea. These details communicated the essential truth of this stage, that death and rebirth were not separate processes but a single movement. Nothing new could be born without something old dying to make room for it. Card 14, Temperance, showed an angelic figure pouring liquid between two vessels, blending and balancing opposing elements. After the radical destruction of the death card, Temperance represented the patient, careful work of integration. The new self that was emerging from the death of the old had to be balanced, tempered, refined. Opposing qualities that had previously been in conflict, thinking and feeling, action and reflection, assertion and surrender, had to be brought into harmony. This was not a dramatic or exciting stage. It was quiet, methodical, and required great patience, but it was essential because without this integration, the transformation initiated by death would remain incomplete. Card 15, the Devil, introduced the encounter with bondage, attachment, and the unconscious forces that kept the developing psyche from reaching its full potential. The Devil did not represent external evil, but internal enslavement, the patterns of addiction, compulsion, and unconscious habit that persisted even after significant psychological growth had occurred. The figure in the card was often depicted with two human figures chained at his feet, but the chains were typically shown as loose enough to be removed. The bondage was real, but not inescapable. It was maintained not by force, but by ignorance or unwillingness to see the truth. Jung recognized that the devil stage often came as a shock to individuals who believed they had already done significant psychological work. They had undergone the death and rebirth of cards 12 through 14. They had achieved new levels of awareness and integration. And yet here, at card 15, they discovered that they were still enslaved by patterns they had not recognized or had believed themselves to have transcended. The Devil card humbled the seeker, reminding them that the journey was not yet complete and that the deepest forms of bondage were often the last to be seen. Card 16, the Tower, depicted a tall structure struck by lightning, its crown blasted open, figures falling from its heights. This was the most violent and dramatic image in the entire sequence, representing the catastrophic destruction of false structures, the sudden revelation that shattered illusions, the lightning bolt of truth that demolished everything built on false foundations. If the death card represented voluntary transformation, the tower represented involuntary revelation, the moment when reality could no longer be denied and the structures of self-deception came crashing down. Jung observed that tower experiences were common in the lives of individuals who had resisted the earlier stages of transformation. Those who had clung to their old identities, who had refused the hangman's invitation to see differently, who had avoided the death card's demand for genuine change, often experienced the tower as a crisis that forced upon them the transformation they had refused to undertake voluntarily. Illness, betrayal, financial collapse, the loss of a relationship, these external catastrophes often served as the lightning bolt that the internal process had failed to provide. Yet the tower, like death, contained within its destruction the seeds of liberation. The structures that fell were false structures, built on illusion and maintained through self-deception. Their destruction, however painful, was ultimately liberating. What remained after the tower fell was not nothing but rather the authentic foundation that had been hidden beneath the false structure all along. Cards 17 through 21 depicted the stages of renewal and completion that followed the Great Destruction. The star, card 17, showed a naked figure kneeling beside a pool of water, pouring water from two vessels, one onto the earth and one back into the pool. Above, a great star shone surrounded by 7 smaller stars. This card represented hope, renewal, and the first glimpse of authentic selfhood after the destruction of the tower. The nakedness of the figure symbolized vulnerability but also authenticity, the state of being stripped of all pretense and standing in one's true nature. The moon, card 18, introduced the territory of the deep unconscious, the realm of dreams, illusions, and the shadows that remained even after the false structures had been demolished. The journey was not over simply because the tower had fallen. The seeker still had to traverse the moonlit landscape of their own unconscious, facing fears, illusions, and uncertainties that could not be resolved through rational understanding alone. The moon stage required trust, the willingness to continue walking a path that could not be clearly seen, guided by a light that was reflected rather than direct. The sun, card 19, represented the emergence into full conscious awareness, the stage at which the seeker, having traversed the darkness of the moon, stepped into the clear light of day. The sun card typically depicted a child riding a white horse, surrounded by sunflowers under a brilliant sun. The child was not the same as the fool at the beginning of the journey. This was a child born from wisdom rather than from ignorance, a new innocence that had been earned through experience rather than preserved through avoidance. The sun represented the joy of authentic selfhood, the vitality that flowed naturally when a person was no longer divided against themselves. Card 20, Judgment, showed figures rising from coffins or graves in response to a trumpet call from an angel above. This card represented the final awakening, the moment when the fully developed self heard and answered its deepest calling. Jung understood judgment not as an external verdict, but as an internal recognition, the moment when a person finally understood what their life had been about, what they had been called to do and be, and responded to that calling with their whole being. It was the stage at which the individuated self recognized its purpose and aligned itself with it completely. The final card, the World, card 21, depicted a dancing figure surrounded by a wreath of laurel, with the 4 creatures of the evangelists, the same 4 symbols that had appeared on the magician's table at the beginning of the journey, now occupying the 4 corners of the image. The world represented completion, integration, and the achievement of conscious wholeness. The dancing figure was the fool transformed, no longer stepping blindly off a cliff, but dancing in the center of a balanced, integrated, fully realized cosmos. The 4 elements that the magician had displayed as tools were now incorporated into the fabric of reality itself. Nothing had been rejected. Everything had been integrated. The journey was complete. But Jung was careful to note that the world card did not represent a final destination from which there was no departure. The tarot's major arcana was arranged in a circle, not a line. After the world came the fool again, at a higher level of the spiral. The journey of individuation was not a process that occurred once and was finished. It was a spiral process that repeated throughout a person's life, each cycle beginning with a new fool's leap into the unknown and progressing through the stages of development at a deeper level of awareness. This cyclical understanding proved crucial for therapeutic practice. Patients who had completed one cycle of the journey and expected to have reached a final state of psychological health were often disappointed when new challenges emerged. Jung used the Fool's Journey framework to help them understand that these new challenges were not failures or regressions, but the beginning of a new cycle, a deeper turn of the spiral that would take them through familiar stages at a new level of depth and complexity. The power of the Fool's Journey as a map of human development lay not in its prescription of what should happen, but in its description of what did happen. Researchers who studied the lives of individuals across many cultures found that the stages depicted in the major arcana corresponded remarkably to the actual patterns of psychological development observed in real people. The early stages of ego formation, the encounter with social roles and expectations, the midlife turn inward, the confrontation with death and transformation, the emergence into authentic selfhood, these were not abstractions or ideals, but observable realities in the lives of individuals who were engaged in the process of becoming fully themselves. What remained most remarkable about the Fool's Journey was its insistence that every stage was necessary. The contemporary tendency to value some stages over others, to celebrate the sun while avoiding the moon, to seek the world while skipping the tower, was, from the tarot's perspective, not merely futile but harmful. Each card represented an essential aspect of human experience that could not be bypassed without cost. The individual who avoided the hermit's solitude would never develop the depth required for later stages. The individual who refused the death card's demand for transformation would eventually encounter the tower's involuntary destruction. The individual who denied the devil's revelations about their unconscious patterns would remain enslaved by those patterns indefinitely. The Fool's Journey, ultimately, was not a prescription for how to live, but a description of what it meant to be fully human. It suggested that every person, regardless of culture, education, or circumstance, was engaged in the same fundamental process. The journey from unconscious potential to conscious realization, from innocence to wisdom, from fragmentation to wholeness. The 22 cards were not predictions of external events, but reflections of internal stages that unfolded naturally when a person was willing to engage with the full range of human experience rather than retreating into the safety of a partial identity. The schoolteacher in the Munich café, turning over cards that had been given to him as a joke, had stumbled upon something that scholars and seekers had been circling for centuries. A story older than any civilization, a map drawn before cartography existed. A journey that every person was already taking, whether they knew it or not. The 22 pictures on the table before him were not illustrations of a story that might someday be told. They were the story, the only story, told in every language and every culture since the beginning of human consciousness. The story of what it means to start with nothing, to lose everything, and to discover, at the end of the longest possible road, that what you were looking for had been with you from the very first step.